Welcome to the second session of our study on the Apocrypha and the Second Book of Maccabees. We're going to talk a little bit today about the books of the Apocrypha and which branches of Christianity use which books. But mostly we're going to talk about the Second Maccabees, and we'll read the third and fourth chapters today. We'll hear more about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We'll introduce the chief priest Onias III, Simon and Heliodorus, a friend of the king. Jason and Menelaus vie for the priesthood in chapter 4. But first we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we've learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The new Oxford Annotated Apocrypha lists 16 different books of the Apocrypha. We said last week that the United Methodist Church and most other Protestant churches do not accept any of them as canonical, that is, as part of the canon. They are not considered sacred scripture. 10 of the books of the Apocrypha, however, are included in the Roman Catholic Bible, but in some cases, books are combined with other books. For example, Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah can be considered two separate books, but in the Catholic Bible, the letter of Jeremiah, which is quite short, is included as chapter 6 of Baruch. The Apocrypha includes a Greek version of the book of Esther. The version of Esther in our Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. The Greek version is longer, contains some additional material, and is substituted for the original Hebrew version in the Roman Catholic Bible. There are 3 short additions to the book of Daniel in the Apocrypha: the prayer of Azariah and the hymn of the 3 young men, Susanna, and Bel and the snake, or sometimes Bel and the dragon. These are all independent stories that are sometimes considered different books, but in the Catholic Bible, they are all included in the book of Daniel. Other books include Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, Seresh, and First and Second Maccabees. All of these books are also included in the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox Bibles. But the Orthodox Bibles also include some additional books. The Greek Orthodox Bible includes First Estrades, the Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, and Third Maccabees. The Russian Orthodox Bible includes those books plus Second Estrades. We have also said that some of the books of the Apocrypha can be used in the common lectionary in United Methodist and other Protestant churches. Seresh 15:15 through 20 is an optional reading for February 12th this year. Wisdom of Solomon 12, 13, 16, and 19 is an option for July 23rd. There are a couple of Wisdom of Solomon options on November 12th. Readings from Seresh, Wisdom of Solomon, and Baruch are all options at some point in 2025. But let's go on to Second Maccabees in chapter 3 right now. We're going to hear a lot about priests in chapter 3, especially about chief priests. A primary requirement to become a Jewish priest was to be a member of the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But priests were not only of the tribe of Levi, they also had to be descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Levites who were not descendants of Aaron could play music in the temple or become temple guards, but they could not be priests. So there's some discussion here about who is a legitimate priest and who's not. We're also going to be talking a lot about the temple in this study. If you remember, it was Solomon who built the temple in Jerusalem somewhere around 950 BCE. The temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. A second temple was mostly completed by Zerubbabel around 515. So the temple we hear about in Second Maccabees is the Second Temple. Herod the Great renovated and expanded the Second Temple late in the 1st century BCE. So that's the temple that we read about in the New Testament. Temples during this period were often thought of to be safe places for the wealthy to store their riches. They did not have safe deposit boxes in the bank in those days, and there were always temple guards around to protect the temple and the artifacts and treasures within it. Remember in session 1, we heard the story of Antiochus being killed by trying to rob a temple in Persia. Finally, the city of Jerusalem is a primary focus of this book. The opening frame or bracket of our story here discusses Jerusalem, and the closing bracket we will read in chapter 15 also talks about the situation in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is key in this story. So we begin with Second Maccabees chapter 3. While the holy city was inhabited in unbroken peace, and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of wickedness, it came about that the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with the finest presents, even to the extent that King Seleucus of Asia defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses connected with the service of the sacrifices. So life was good in the holy city of Jerusalem during the time of the high priest Onias III, son of Simeon II. Antiochus III and his son and successor Secund IV were seen as supporters of the temple. They gave the temple tax breaks. Secund IV was king of the Seleucid Empire at the time our story begins. So this was somewhere between 187 and 175 BCE. And life was good. And we go on with verse 4. But a man named Simon of the tribe of Balgia, who had been made captain of the temple, had a disagreement with the high priest about the administration of the city market. Since he could not prevail over Onias, he went to Apollonius of Tarsus, who at that time was governor of Cola, Syria, and Phoenicia, and reported to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was full of untold sums of money, so that the amount of the funds could not be reckoned, and that they did not belong to the account of the sacrifices, but that it was possible for them to fall under the control of the king. When Apollonius met the king, he told him of the money about which he had been informed. The king chose Heliodorus, who was in charge of his affairs, and sent him with commands to effect the removal of the reported wealth. Heliodorus at once set out on his journey, ostensibly to make a tour of inspection of the cities of Coele and Phoenicia, but in fact to carry out the king's purpose. So Coele was a territory north and east of Jerusalem, and Phoenicia was north along the Mediterranean coast. Both territories were south of the capital city of Antioch. Simon, we are told, was a captain of the temple and clearly a troublemaker. We note that in Second Maccabees, the Greek kings are generally benevolent and most of the Jews are good folks, but there are a few rotten apples, and Simon was one of those guys. Simon could have been a Hellenizer prepared to sacrifice principles of Mosaic law in the execution of his office. As an administrator of a temple whose treasury was as much concerned with secular as religious financial affairs, Simon may have been responsible for the finances of Judea under Syria. Simon went to Apollonius with his tale of untold riches, and Apollonius went to the king, Secund. Secund chose Heliodorus, one of his chief lieutenants, to investigate and remove the wealth from the Jerusalem temple. The king needed the money to pay the Roman fine levied on Antiochus III by the Treaty of Apima in 188. Let's go to verses 9 through 12. When he had arrived at Jerusalem and had been kindly welcomed by the high priest of the city, he told about the disclosure that had been made and stated why he had come, and he inquired whether this really was the situation. The high priest explained that there were some deposits belonging to widows and orphans, and also some money of Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a man of very prominent position, and that it totaled in all 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. To such an extent, the impious Simon had misrepresented the facts. And he said that it was utterly impossible that wrong should be done to these people who had trusted in the holiness of the place and the sanctity and inviolability of the temple that is honored throughout the whole world. So caring for widows and orphans was a basic Jewish religious duty, and Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, was perhaps related to the high priest Onias. Hyrcanus was also thought to be an Egyptian sympathizer, not a friend of the Syrians. So we go on. But Heliodorus, because of the orders he had from the king, said that the money must in any case be confiscated for the king's treasury. So he set a day and went to direct the inspection of these funds. There was no little distress throughout the whole city. The priests prostrated themselves before the altar in their priestly vestments and called toward heaven upon him who had given the law about deposits, that he should keep them safe for those who had deposited them. To see the appearance of the high priest was to be wounded at heart, for his face and the change in his color disclosed the anguish of his soul. For terror and bodily trembling had come over the man, which plainly showed to those who looked at him the pain lodged in his heart. People also hurried out of their houses in crowds to make a general supplication, because the holy place was about to be brought into dishonor. Women girded with sackcloth under their breasts thronged the streets. Some of the young women who were kept indoors ran together to the gates, and some to the walls, while others peered out of the windows, and holding up their hands to heaven, they all made supplication. There was something pitiable in the prostration of the whole populace, and the anxiety of the high priest in his great anguish. A Gentile like Heliodorus was only allowed to go into the outer court, as Onias III had decreed. To reach the treasury, he had to enter the inner court, and this would add to the dismay. Deposits were sacred under the care of heaven. There was also a general fear that Heliodorus might also remove some of the temple vessels. The grave concern was evident throughout Jerusalem. So let's continue. While they were calling upon the Almighty Lord that he would keep what had been entrusted safe and secure for those who had entrusted it, Heliodorus went on with what had been decided. But when he arrived at the treasury with his bodyguard, then and there the sovereign of spirits and of all authority caused so great a manifestation that all who had been so bold as to accompany him were astounded by the power of God and became faint with terror. For there appeared to them a magnificently adorned horse with a rider of frightening appearance. It rushed furiously at Heliodorus and struck at him with his front hoofs. Its rider was seen to have armor and weapons of gold. 2 young men also appeared to him, remarkably strong, gloriously beautiful, and splendidly dressed, who stood on either side of him and flogged him continuously, inflicting many blows on him. When he suddenly fell to the ground and deep darkness came over him, his men took him up, put him on a stretcher, and carried him away. This man, who had just entered the aforesaid treasury with a great retinue and all his bodyguard, but was now unable to help himself with all his weapons, he recognized clearly the sovereign power of God. So a fearsome rider with 2 young men, angelic figures, and they thrashed Heliodorus to the point of death. Even members of Heliodorus' bodyguard recognized the sovereign power of God. Verse 29. While he lay prostrate, speechless, because of the divine intervention and deprived of any hope of recovery, they praised the Lord who had acted marvelously for his own place. And the temple, which a little while before was full of fear and disturbance, was filled with joy and gladness, now that the Almighty Lord had appeared. Some of Heliodorus' friends quickly begged Onias to call upon the Most High to grant life to one who was lying quite at his last breath. So the high priest, fearing that the king might get the notion that some foul play had been perpetrated by the Jews with regard to Heliodorus, offered sacrifice for the man's recovery. While the high priest was making atonement, the same young men appeared again to Heliodorus, dressed in the same clothing, and they stood and said, "Be very grateful to the high priest Onias, since for his sake the Lord has granted you your life. And see that you who have been flogged by heaven report to all people the majestic power of God." Having said this, they vanished. The high priest could make expiation by means of a sin offering for doing inadvertently what is forbidden in any commandment of the Lord. But here the personal worth of Onias seems to be a factor in the successful expiation. The intercessor's quality could make a difference. Then Heliodorus offered sacrifice to the Lord and made very great vows to the Savior of his life. And having bidden Onias farewell, he marched off with his forces to the king. He bore testimony to all concerning the deeds of the supreme God, which he had seen with his own eyes. It seems very unlikely that Heliodorus would have made a sacrifice in the temple. He would have been allowed to pray, but the rules don't allow sacrifice for a non-Jew. One exception may have been Alexander the Great, who is said by Josephus to have made a sacrifice under the high priest's guidance. A Gentile could also worship the supreme, most high God without becoming a Jew. He just couldn't make sacrifices. We go to verse 37. When the king asked Heliodorus what sort of person would be suitable to send on another mission to Jerusalem, he replied, "If you have any enemy or plotter against your government, send him there, for you will get him back thoroughly flogged, if he survives at all. For there is certainly some power of God about the place. For he who has his dwelling in heaven watches over that place himself, and brings it aid, and he strikes and destroys those who come to do it injury." This was the outcome of the episode of Heliodorus and the protection of the treasury. Suclius perhaps blamed the failure of the mission on the character of Heliodorus. Apparently he was not suitable to the task. He asked Heliodorus what sort of person would be suitable. There is some irony in Heliodorus' answer, because ultimately he was the one who conspired against Suclius and brought about his death. The theme we see here about the power of God runs throughout the remainder of the book. We don't always see a man riding on a tremendous horse, but we do see the power of God. We go on to chapter 4, where Simon again appears to make trouble. There are troubles in Antioch, the capital of Syria. The political climate outside of Judea begins to play a larger role in chapter 4, so we begin to expand our worldview. We will even see a new priest who wants to create a little bit of Antioch in Jerusalem. So we go on to chapter 4. The previously mentioned Simon, who had informed about the money against his own country, slandered Onias, saying that it was he who had incited Heliodorus and had been the real cause of the misfortune. He dared to designate as a plotter against the government the man who was the benefactor of the city, the protector of his compatriots, and a zealot for the laws. When his hatred progressed to such a degree that even murders were committed by one of Simon's approved agents, Onias recognized that the rivalry was serious, that an Apollonius, son of Mithses and governor of Col Assyria and Phoenicia, was intensifying the malice of Simon. So he appealed to the king, not accusing his compatriots, but having in view the welfare both public and private of all the people. For he saw that without the king's attention, public affairs could not again reach a peaceful settlement, and that Simon would not stop his folly. So Simon claimed that Heliodorus had been incited by Onias III to seize the funds in the temple treasury. The slander was apparently Simon's way of getting revenge and keeping his own interests alive. Onias sought to warn Suclius about his true enemies and their plots, but was prevented by the death of Suclius. We go on to verse 7. When Suclius died, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king through a petition 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the people of Jerusalem as the Antoachines in Jerusalem. When the king assented and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his compatriots over to the Greek way of life. We mentioned a couple of times the treaty between the Roman Republic and the Suclian Empire. The Romans had defeated Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. In the subsequent treaty of Apima, one of his sons, Antiochus IV, was held hostage in Rome. After Antiochus III died, his older son, Suclius IV, reigned on the throne. He also said to have been assassinated by Heliodorus in 175. With the death of Suclius, Antiochus IV returned to Syria and ascended to the throne, being replaced in Rome by Demetrius I, Suclius' young son. Onias' brother Jason here saw an opportunity to benefit from there being a new king in town and offered Antiochus IV bribes or tributes to get him to make him high priest in place of Onias. Antiochus also had to get rid of Heliodorus. Onias' friend, the pro-Egyptian sympathizer Hyrcanus, committed suicide. Jason also promised to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem to raise more funds for the king. He also drew up a list of Hellenizers in Jerusalem to support this new endeavor, called Antioch at Jerusalem. So we go on to verse 11. He set aside the existing concessions to the Jews secured through John, the father of Epolumus, who went on the mission to establish friendship and alliance with the Romans. And he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. He took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon the service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal for the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon the Greek forms of prestige. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and punished them. It is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact that later events will make clear. So this new Greek-style stadium would put Jerusalem on a par with other Greek cities in the Syrian Empire, and thereby setting aside the royal privileges granted by Antiochus III, by which the Jews could have a form of government in accordance with their own laws, the law of Moses. Greek practices were now to be allowed, and the law code became Hellenistic in form. The youths entering the stadium or gymnasium had to wear Greek-style brimmed hats associated with the Greek god Hermes. When the quadrennial games were being held at Tyre and the king was present, vile Jason sent envoys chosen as being Antiochenes from Jerusalem to carry 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. Those who carried the money, however, thought best not to use it for sacrifice because that was inappropriate, but to expend it for another purpose. So this money was intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules, but by the decision of its carriers, it was applied to the construction of termines. So the quinquennial games, held every 5 years, were a big deal. At Tyre, they were held in honor of the city's god Melkart, whose Greek equivalent was taken to be Hercules. Even the Hellenizing Jews who represented Jerusalem were uneasy at sacrificing to Hercules, so they didn't. We go on to verse 21. When Apollonius, son of Minthises, was sent to Egypt for the coronation of Philometor as king, Antiochus learned that Thelmito had become hostile to his government, and he took measures for his own security. Therefore, upon arriving at Joppa, he proceeded to Jerusalem. He was welcomed magnificently by Jason, and the city ushered in with a blaze of torches and with shouts. Then he marched his army into Phoenicia. With Onias in exile and Hyrcanus dead, the pro-Egyptian party was leaderless. So Antiochus received a somewhat warm welcome when he arrived in Jerusalem. He was pleased at that. We go on to verse 23. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of the essential business. But he, when presented to the king, extolled him with an air of authority and secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. After receiving the king's orders, he returned possessing no qualification for the high priesthood, but having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. So Jason, who after supplanting his own brother was supplanted by another man, was driven as a fugitive to the land of Ammon. Although Menelaus continued to hold the office, he did not pay regularly any of the money promised to the king. When Sesostris, the captain of the citadel, kept requesting payment, for the collection of the revenue was his responsibility, the two of them were summoned by the king on account of this issue. Menelaus left his own brother Lysimachus as deputy in the high priesthood, while Sesostris left Crates, the commander of the Cyprian troops. 3 years have passed, so our date is now 172 at the end or the beginning of 171 BCE. Jason, now the high priest, sends Simon's brother Menelaus to the king with the tribute that Jason had promised. But Menelaus promised the king even more if he would make him the high priest. According to our Jewish Greek author, nothing could make a man with Menelaus' moral and hereditary failings worthy of the high priesthood. He uses the harshest charges a Greek could against him, tyrant and savage beast. We note that this is not a dispassionate history that we are reading. Our writer is willing to let his feelings be known. While such was the state of affairs, it happened that the people of Tarsus and of Melis revolted because their cities had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. So the king went hurriedly to settle the trouble, leaving Andronicus, a man of high rank, to act as his deputy. But Menelaus, thinking he had obtained a suitable opportunity, stole some of the gold vessels of the temple and gave them to Andronicus. Other vessels, as it happened, he had sold to Tyre and the neighboring cities. When Onias became fully aware of these acts, he publicly exposed them, having first withdrawn to a place of sanctuary at Daphne, near Antioch. Therefore Menelaus, taking Andronicus' side, urged him to kill Onias. Andronicus came to Onias and, resorting to treachery, offered him sworn pledges and gave him his right hand. He persuaded him, in spite of his suspicions, to come out from the place of sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately put him out of the way. It was not beneath Menelaus to steal from the temple that he was in charge of and bribe one of the king's ministers. Onias' denunciation of the stealing of the vessel, the brass plate, by Menelaus led to his assassination by the king's regent. Verse 35. For this reason, not only Jews, but many also of other nations were grieved and displeased at the unjust murder of the man. When the king returned from the region of Cilicia, the Jews in the city appealed to him with regard to the unreasonable murder of Onias, and the Greeks shared their hatred of the crime. Therefore, Antiochus was grieved at heart and filled with pity and wept because of the moderation and good conduct of the deceased. Inflamed with anger, he immediately stripped the purple robe from Andronicus, tore off his clothes, and led him around the whole city to that very place where he had committed the outrage against Onias, and there he dispatched the bloodthirsty fellow. The Lord thus repaid him with the punishment he deserved. There was apparently a large colony of Jews in Antioch, and when the king Antiochus returned, they appealed to him, and he relieved his regent Andronicus of his position and had him killed. It's also possible that Antiochus thought Onias might have been a useful card to hold in reserve against a too independent Menelaus. Verse 39. When many acts of sacrilege had been committed in the city by Lysimachus, with the connivance of Menelaus, and when report of them had spread abroad, the populace gathered against Lysimachus because of many of the gold vessels had already been stolen. Since the crowds were becoming aroused and filled with anger, Lysimachus, armed with 3,000 men, and launched an unjust attack under the leadership of a certain Onias, a man advanced in years and no less advanced in folly. But when the Jews became aware that Lysimachus was attacking them, some picked up stones and blocks of wood, and others took handfuls of ashes that were lying around and threw them in wild confusion at Lysimachus and his men. As a result, they wounded many of them and killed some, and put all the rest to flight, the temple robber himself they killed close by the treasury. If you remember, Lysimachus was the brother of Menelaus, who had been left in charge of the temple when Menelaus went to Antioch. He had been plundering the temple also. This theft of Jewish national treasure enraged the Jews and led to a public riot. Verse 43. Charges were brought against Menelaus about this incident. When the king came to Tyre, 3 men sent by the Senate presented their case before him. But Menelaus, already as good as beaten, promised a substantial bribe to Ptolemy, son of Darmenes, to win over the king. Therefore Ptolemy, taking the king aside into a colonnade as for refreshment, induced the king to change his mind. Menelaus, the cause of all the trouble, he acquitted on the charges against him, while he sentenced to death those unfortunate men who would have been freed uncondemned if they had pleaded even before the Scythians. And so those who had spoken for the city and the villages and the holy vessels quickly suffered an unjust penalty. Therefore, even the Tyrrhenians, showing their hatred of the crime, provided magnificently for the funeral. But Menelaus, because of the greed of those in power, remained in office, growing in wickedness, having become the chief plotter against his compatriots. So bribes seemed always to work in Antioch. The Senate's deputies were executed on technical grounds, apparently, having brought false accusations, even though they weren't false. So we see the stark contrast here between the barbarian Scythians, the proverbial brutal people north of the Black Sea, and the Greek Tyrrhenians, who both had some sense of justice, and the inherently evil Antiochus and Menelaus, the very bottom of the barrel, according to the author. In session 3, we will read chapters 5 through 7. Jason attempts to come back, and we will read much more about the atrocities of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the desecration of the temple, and the martyrdom of Eleazar and the 7 brothers. Our next discussion session will be Thursday, January 12th at 6:30 p.m. If you would like to don't forget to let me know. You can send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org and I'll send you the Zoom link. In the meantime, have a good week.